Yo, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's good to be back myself. Hopefully everybody's doing well, and today I wanted to take a look at a franchise that has had an incredible staying power in pop culture for a very long time. Of course, that is The Simpsons. I think it's safe to say the show needs no introduction, and I really couldn't say anything that hasn't already been said when it comes to the actual characters, the universe, the show, etc. There's a reason that it has had such a lasting impact on pop culture, but the games, I think, are quite fascinating in their own right, and if you've followed this franchise and have seen the games since the beginning, you'll know that the track record of The Simpsons when it comes to game adaptations has been pretty rough for the most part. But I do have a stack of games here. These are games that I have purchased with my own money that I think are worthy of being in collections for one reason or another. We're also going to talk about a few games that aren't here, but we'll get to that as we get to it. These are games that I think are at least worth covering in this video, and I want to try and convince some people maybe to check these ones out if you've passed up on them. I know it is a bit of a minefield when it comes to the Simpsons games, so I kind of want to break things down for you, give you my thoughts, my impressions, and whether or not these games are worth adding to maybe your personal collections. And before we get into the games here, I'd like to briefly ask if you have been checking out the videos on the channel recently and you like what you see and you want to make sure you see more of it, please hit that subscribe button. I imagine that a lot of people probably like what we're putting out and aren't going to be notified of new videos, especially with my schedule being a full-time streamer. Sometimes our schedule here is a little wacky, but we're trying to get content out as much as we can, and I just want to make sure people don't miss out. So anyways, let's get into it. Now, throughout this video, a lot of ironies will probably surface, and that's just kind of par for the course with The Simpsons. And the reason that this first game is ironic, I feel like there is no better position to start than to talk about the first ever Simpsons game that was released to the public. And that was in 1991 in the arcades initially, later got ports to DOS and Commodore 64, as well as some later ports that we'll talk about here in a moment. But that is the Konami beat 'em up that released in arcades in March of 1991. It's just titled The Simpsons, and I think for a lot of people, you're probably aware of this one if you've done any sort of research on The Simpsons and you're a video game fan, but it needs to be discussed because it is ironically probably one of the best games in the entire franchise. For a franchise that really has gotten a lot of bad video games, Konami came out of the gate swinging with this one. It's an absolutely excellent beat 'em up. It plays a lot like their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles beat 'em ups of the era. Not only are the visuals absolutely stunning, this is a gorgeous game for 1991, but also the mechanics are pretty solid. Obviously, it is a beat 'em up, and you're kind of in this pseudo 3D space, right? But you have these sprites, and so therefore the Z-axis movement is very important in a beat 'em up like this. Mechanically, it is quite satisfying. You only have a couple attack moves each, but what is nice is you get a roster of characters. You get the whole Simpsons family. You get Marge, Bart, Homer, Lisa. They're all playable, and obviously Konami cared to make a great video game here, and they really, I think, just knocked it out of the park right away. It's such an incredible beat 'em up. I definitely recommend, if you somehow haven't played it already, you definitely should. And unfortunately, though, it is a little hard to get your hands on because there were a couple of ports to the 360 and PS3 on their digital stores back in the early 2010s, but those have since been removed and they are no longer purchasable for reasons unknown. The only actual official modern way to get it is with the arcade 1-up that released a few years back, and it includes, of course, the beat 'em up as well as Simpsons Bowling, which is kind of an interesting one as well. But obviously, that being the only way to play these games besides emulation, unfortunately, is not the easiest game to get your hands on. But if you are able to play it, it is definitely a highlight. It is arguably one of the best games. I don't know if I'd say it's the best. There are a couple toward the end that we're going to talk about that might just ever so squeak ahead above it, but it is one of the excellent beat 'em ups of the era. And with the arcade game out of the way, I would like to now turn our attention to the home consoles of the era. We're going to start delving into the 8 and 16-bit games here for a moment, and obviously with the arcade game doing as well as it did, it really was just going to pave the way for everything else that was to come. And unfortunately, this is where the quality drops pretty considerably, pretty fast. And if you saw our 100 worst NES games video, you'll know that every Simpsons game on the Nintendo made it onto that list. And in fact, only one of them I thought was enjoyable enough to put in what I called the fun bad tier, and that's the one we're going to talk about a little bit more here today. That one is called The Simpsons Bart versus the World. And for those that don't know, pretty much every game on the Nintendo that had The Simpsons in it was made by a company called Imagineering, and they were pretty much the kings of licensed IP shovelware. They really just churned these games out in a very quick, factory-style fashion, and it resulted in a lot of not very good games, just frankly unfun, unfair, frustrating, bad times. We're talking games like Bart versus the Space Mutants, the Itchy and Scratchy game. I mean, the list goes on. A lot of these are really rough, and I think Bart vs. the World at least has some redeeming qualities. First of all is the fact that, yes, it does have a lot of platforming style gameplay. That is one of the main methods of play in this game. But the nice thing about this one is the fact that the levels, unlike some of the other games on the system, are not these drawn out, incredibly long experiences that you may or may not possibly ever see the end of. These levels are quite short, so they're quite a bit more tolerable. And in addition to that, you do get a number of mini games also as well sprinkled in that you also need to play in order to progress. So the nice thing about this one is you get a decent amount of variety. I would say the presentation is slightly better, especially with all these different game modes. You got like slider puzzles and a slot machine game mode, as well as kind of this like quiz show element, and it all comes together to at least be much more entertaining than a lot of what was on the Nintendo for this franchise. So if there's only one game on the NES that I would recommend you play, if you must play one, I don't necessarily recommend this one to everybody, but if you want just one and you want the best one, I would say Bart vs. the World is the one for your money. And moving on to the 16-bit generation with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, unfortunately, this is kind of a similar case to the NES era of trying to find the best of the worst. If you guys saw our 100 worst Super Nintendo games video, you'll know pretty much every Simpsons game on that console made it to the list, and including this game. We had Bart's Nightmare, of course, which upon further thought I think is slightly worse than this one, ever so slightly, as well as the Itchy and Scratchy game and Krusty's Funhouse, which both of which I did not care for much at all. I would say, once again, if you just need one game, you're a fan of The Simpsons, and you're like, just give me something on SNES or Genesis that is worth playing, you know, the best of the worst, I would go with Virtual Bart here. And like Bart vs. the World, once again, this is a minigame comp. This was not done by Imagineering. This was actually done by a company called Sculptured Software, and like Imagineering, though, they were pretty much kind of shovelware licensed IP factory workers pretty much for the majority of their output. They did have an occasional banger here and there, and this is kind of an interesting one because basically it is 6 like proper games in one. I mean, really, they could have released any of these 6 games on their own as its own standalone game. Instead, you get 6, which sounds like a great value proposition off the get. The problem is about half of them aren't very good, right? So we're going to go ahead and talk about these one by one briefly, real fast, just to give you guys a glimpse of each one. I would say starting from the worst would be probably the Baby Bart minigame, in which you are a infant toddler Bart and you are swinging along these trees, these branches, throwing yourself onto the next tree, the next branch. Eventually you get to some clotheslines with clothing and cats attacking you. It's just a really rough time. Anytime you fall is an instant death. Very awkward controls, weird momentum and swinging mechanics, just not very fun at all. Additionally, we have another platforming game with the Pig Bart section, in which you're in like Krusty's meat factory, and for some reason your Bart is a pig, rescuing other pigs from their untimely demise, turning into Bart corn dogs, as you see in the game over screen for this one. Just some puzzle solving elements in this one that are very obnoxious. The level design is very hard to follow and just really, really annoying. A rough time with this one as well. Additionally, you get one last platforming minigame with Bart as a dinosaur. I would argue of the 3 platforming games here, this is probably the best one, but it's still not all that great. Very floaty jumping, not very precise or tight control, especially considering some of the jumps here. Some annoying obstacles and just enemies constantly in your way. It is the best of the 3 platforming games, but it's really not saying much on this one. Now to get to the 3 that I think are actually worth checking out, first of which is this slide minigame in which you're going down this series of slide tubes, and essentially really just the gameplay, other than kind of shifting your body weight occasionally, is selecting between branching paths left and right occasionally. And you might think it's just like random RNG luck or memorization to figure out how you get through this slide, but actually, if you watch, there's this older gentleman in a green shirt, and depending on the shading of the shirt, either left or right, actually tells you which way to go. It's strange that they gave that as an indicator, but if you want a little tip there, that's how you get through that. That one's all right. It's very basic, like I said, not a whole lot of really engaging gameplay, but it's at least less obnoxious than a lot of the platforming ones. Now, the 2 mini games I think that are probably worth picking this up at all for are the tomato throwing minigame, in which you play outside of Springfield Elementary and you're trying to lob tomatoes at fellow classmates, as well as Principal Skinner and Miss Crapapple. Crapapple? Oh, shit. All your goal is to lob tomatoes at the fellow classmates, as well as Principal Skinner and Ms. Crabapple, as well as Chief Wiggum and Groundskeeper Willie. It's a very simple premise, but the way in which you not only angle your shot, but also you have this power meter that goes up and down the Z-axis that defines how hard you're going to throw. There's kind of a rhythm timing based element to it, trying to lob the shots perfectly just to hit them just right. It is quite satisfying and way more engaging than I ever would have thought. Now, the bike riding minigame is my personal favorite. I think it's probably no secret to anybody that knows me, knows my propensity for racing games, as well as just like Mode 7 style, which is surprising, especially on Genesis, that they got a pretty decent like Mode 7 style racing game here with the bike riding. And it's just really fun, simple, very like Road Rash-esque. Very engaging, simple gameplay, but quite a lot of fun. Like I said, this one's a lot easier though, so even though it probably is my favorite, I just haven't played as much because the tomato one is oddly good. So overall, like I said, this is probably, you know, filled with about half good games, half bad, but I do think the good is good enough to at least check out Virtual Bart. If you're looking for one game on these platforms to check out of this era, Virtual Bart is probably the one to go with. All right, now we're going to go ahead and jump ahead here a little bit. It might not seem like we're jumping ahead too much, going from Super Nintendo and Genesis to the PlayStation 1, and I'm sure saying that right away, some people are already going to know which game this is. Trust me, please hear me out here. Don't skip to the next part of the video. I have some things to say about this one. I'm going to go to bat for this game, actually, because I have seen this on multiple lists. I've seen it, people covering all the Simpsons games, worst to best. I'm not going to name any names or anything, but this often goes like toward the bottom or at the very bottom. And I personally find this way more fun than some of the absolute garbage that came out for this franchise, and that is the Simpsons Wrestling. Now, before I get into why I like this game, I want to make a couple things clear, okay? This was a 2001 release on the PlayStation, very late release. This is not a good game, okay? Some people are like, he's going to defend it. It must be a good game. Listen, when we're talking about games in a retrospective sense, I can understand if you got burned buying this back in 2001, you paid like full price or whatever. I could understand being mad about this, but okay, we are looking at this in a retrospective lens. I spent way less than this game originally went for, basically nothing. And playing it in a modern context for some dumb, silly fun, this game more than does the trick. Obviously, it's a wrestling game. You get a whole roster of different characters, actually like a dozen different characters from the franchise. It's quite full-featured in terms of the characters it allows you to play. And each character gets 3 different moves. You get a basic attack that's usually like a punch or a kick or a slap or what have you. And then as you fill up your stamina meter, you get these other 2 attacks. In Ned Flanders' case, for instance, the secondary attack is this Bible throwing attack, so you can just throw Bibles at your opponent. And I'm going to talk about Ned because he is far and away the most OP character in this, and I would argue that if you've tried this before and didn't like it, or you've just heard nothing but smack talk on the internet about this one, use the code Unlock Ned Flanders. He is super OP. At the very least, you can mash your way through it and have fun, or if you want to actually get into the mechanics, there is a lot to enjoy here. Ned, for example, his special attack that takes most of the stamina meter, each character has one, and it basically depletes most of your stamina. Ned can summon lightning from the heavens, and it is super OP, lots of fun, absolutely ridiculous. And the other thing about Ned that makes him the most OP character, and the one that I recommend people start with, is because he gets a second life. He can be resurrected by God. If he goes down, he gets a full-on revival and basically a second health bar, which none of the other characters have. It makes him totally stupid and broken, which is part of the reason I love playing this game. Even playing as like groundskeeper Willie with his rake that he smacks people around with. You know, you got Bumblebee Man with his chihuahua. You got Homer throwing bowling balls at the opponent. Like, just, you can't take this game seriously, okay? And that's all I'm saying here. I think if you pick this up and you like your fun, stupid jank, you're gonna have a good time with this one. And if you can't have a good time with this one, I think you're just taking it too gosh darn seriously. So that is my thoughts on Simpsons Wrestling. I think I've ranted enough. Hopefully I've convinced some people to try it. I promise if you go in with low expectations, it's actually a pretty fun little time waster. And now with Simpsons Wrestling out of the way, we really do enter into what I would consider like almost like the early 2000s Simpsons video game renaissance here. We got a number of games that came out during this decade that I think really just like took the Simpsons franchise in video game form like into its own. It's like finally we're getting like a significant amount of consistently at least decent games here, and that actually kind of kicked off with Simpsons Road Rage. This was a very early release for the 6th gen consoles. I actually grew up with the Xbox version here, which came out in 2001. The PS2 version also came out. I got this one actually fairly recently and had never played it until very, very recently. This one I want to talk about a little bit later. They are pretty much the same game for all intents and purposes with a few minor caveats that we'll get to. But this is a childhood game of mine. I might be a little biased when I say Renaissance here, but I genuinely think that we started to get like properly fun Simpsons games during this era. And for those that are unaware of Road Rage, the conceit of this one is that Mr. Burns is like trying to take over Springfield with this line of nuclear buses, and Homer and the gang all go out to basically try and steal Burns' business and shut down one of his evil schemes, right? And this one plays pretty much like Crazy Taxi. It's basically a carbon copy. In fact, it is so similar in terms of driving, picking up passengers, earning fares, that Sega actually tried to sue EA. They almost took them to court. They actually settled out of court. So obviously EA was pretty well aware. Radical Entertainment was pretty well aware of what they were doing here. I mean, you just look at it and it's a Crazy Taxi clone. That being said, this is a fun game. It's well made for the most part. It does have a little bit of that early 6th gen aesthetic visually. You'll see with Radical Entertainment's next game that we'll get to. The visuals got a significant bump up there, but this one looks fine for a pretty early 6th gen game. It also doesn't maybe run the absolute best, which is something I discovered especially when playing the PS2 version here. The Xbox version that I grew up with plays incredibly well for the most part. There is the occasional hiccup here or there, but the PS2 version has some pretty significant slowdown and frame rate issues that I was not aware of until much later. The other thing about Road Rage that I will say is a bit of a downside is if you do compare it to something like a Crazy Taxi, mechanically it is so much more inferior. There is very little here in terms of like proper, really deep mechanics. If you've played Crazy Taxi and gotten it all into it, which I have, I've spent probably tens if not hundreds of hours at this point streaming it on Twitch. I love Crazy Taxi, and unfortunately Road Rage here does not offer the same level of like, you know, limit breaking and crazy drifting and boosting and all that sort of stuff. It really doesn't have any of those mechanics. This is a very basic driving game. You go, you stop, you know, you pick up passengers. You know, there isn't really anything in terms of like really deep, complex mechanics. But a game like this, I don't think you expect that. I will say you get 6 maps here, a number of characters. It's all presented very well. It's very faithful to the source material. I think this is just a decent love letter to the franchise, even if the game isn't necessarily like a, you know, home run, slam dunk, knock out of the park, 10 out of 10 kind of experience. I would say this is still like a solid 7.5, maybe 8 if I'm feeling a little generous. And again, I have a lot of nostalgia for this one. In fact, this is like one of the first video game reviews I did on my old channel.
Sadly, I have no one else to play with.
It it's still up if you want to watch that. I've come a long way, I like to think. But yeah, this one's a fun one overall. I do recommend it if you're a Simpsons fan, you like this era of gaming, you like Crazy Taxi. But like I said, don't expect a Crazy Taxi level experience. Expect like a decent little fun carbon copy, and I think you'll have a good time. And I would also be remiss not to talk about Road Rage and not talk about the GBA version, which I also ended up picking up as a kid. And, you know, as a dumb kid, I picked this up, I guess, thinking I was going to get the console version and being kind of disappointed, which, again, is a very silly way to approach it, because how could you expect the GBA to run a console level experience like that? I think this is actually a very well made game. This is by a company called Ultron, which have made some other games like RoboPit on the PS1 that I quite like. And this is a really decent distillation of what the console game was trying to offer. Once again, you get kind of a Crazy Taxi-like experience, although I will say this is significantly better than the Crazy Taxi we got on GBA. This knocks the socks out off of that one, I think. And this is just a really solid Mode 7 style, basically distillation of what the console was trying to do. And in fact, I think in terms of the Road Rage games, I would argue in some ways this is more impressive and better than the console version, especially in the mission mode that I didn't really touch upon in the console version. The mission mode in the console version is pretty basic. You get like 10 missions. And in this GBA version, not only are the missions just more expanded, you do get some carryovers from the console version, but you also get just some absolutely insane ones, like Frank flying his hovercraft, jumping on clouds, really satisfying, as well as a very lengthy mission in which you're kind of in like Krusty's carnival tent doing like 3 different objectives all in the same mission. It's quite tense, very difficult, and decently challenging, also very rewarding. So the mission mode on this absolutely kicks ass. I would say between the console and the handheld, this is great for the mission mode, and the regular Road Rage mode is decent and impressive for the handheld. I would give the Road Rage to the console version a slight edge overall, but these are both excellent titles that I think are worth checking out if you're at all a Simpsons fan. Like I said, you know, this one's probably 7.5, 8 out of 10. This one probably for GBA standards is like 8, 8.5. I think these are really solid games. And even though they are Crazy Taxi clones, they're a heck of a lot of fun. Once again, if you don't set your expectations incredibly high. And I was debating about what order to talk about these next ones in, and I think I gotta leave the other one for last. I think people are already gonna know what it is, so just in case anybody wants to click off because they've heard everything there is to say about the next game, we'll talk about the Simpsons Game. This one came out in 2007. You'll see I've got the PS2 and the Wii versions here. This is a game that came out on a lot of platforms. I mean, we're talking there's a DS version, there's a PSP edition, there's also, of course, 7th gen versions with the 360 and PS3. I've played these, well, I guess 6th and 7th, but I mean, let's be honest, the Wii's a fucking 6th gen game console pretty much in terms of hardware power, right? These are pretty much the same game, so you might be wondering why I have both. Well, first of all, actually, if you're not aware, every version of this game has a different cover art, which is really unique. I think eventually I would like to try to get all of them. I don't have the PS3, 360, you know, all the other ones I listed. I would like to get them at some point, but even though these games are pretty much the same, one of the reasons I did want to get them both is because you do get alternate covers, which is pretty dope. The fact that like every console this released on got a different cover art. But this is a really solid action-adventure, third-person platformer in which you do get to take on a number of the characters from the Simpsons family. You get to start out as Homer. Of course, you also get to play as Bart, Marge, Lisa, and they all have their own kind of special moves that correspond to their personalities. You know, Homer likes to eat a lot of stuff. He has this giant ball ability where he can roll around. Bart, of course, can turn into Bartman. He's also got a slingshot. Lisa has this really cool, like, Buddha-style ability where she can pick objects up from the sky and kind of move them around and doing some puzzle-solving action. Marge almost has, like, a Lemmings-style kind of micromanagement system in which you can order different AI to repair things, attack things. This is just a very ambitious, impressive game. It tries to do a lot. It doesn't maybe do all of it exceptionally well, but it's a really fun time. I've played through this a couple times. Once again, I'm a little nostalgic for this one. This was like one of the first games I ever streamed over on my Twitch channel back when I started like 5 years ago now. It's weird to think it's been that long. But overall, just really solid presentation. Also excellent writing. You get cutscenes that are actually presented like an episode from the show. Although it is a little jarring when you go from like the hand-drawn style into like an in-game cutscene, which this game has a tendency to do. It's a little jarring, but on the whole, I think this is a really solid experience. It's probably the most fully fleshed out, full-featured Simpsons experience in general that I would say, and for those reasons, I definitely think it's worth checking out, and it's been overshadowed by the next game. And last but certainly not least, I figure you guys know this one's coming, and of course we have to talk about it. It's easily my favorite Simpsons game of all time, and it's many of yours. Pretty much the internet has decided this is pretty much the best one, and that is the Simpsons Hit and Run. Once again, another irony in the Simpsons catalog here. This was done by Radical Entertainment, who had done Road Rage a couple years prior, and while that game was a Crazy Taxi clone, this one is pretty much considered a GTA clone, which I would mostly agree with, although I would argue a little bit and say that this one even more so emphasizes driving than anything. This is one of the things that really people don't seem to mention when talking about this game. You know, they mention it's a GTA clone. You've got various levels of Springfield that you can roam around in. The realization of the Simpsons Springfield town is really impressive in this game. It's absolutely gorgeous. The art style, like I said, is leaps and bounds better than Road Rage. I'm not sure what Radical did to make this game look so much better just a few years later, but it looks absolutely phenomenal by comparison. It's a gorgeous game. But also the fact that, like I said, this is mostly driving. I'd say it's like 95% driving. There is very little out of the car gameplay in this. Occasionally you get maybe a single level as Bart, a single level as Marge, where you're going around doing some light platforming. But this game is a driving game through and through, but it does a very good job of mixing up the mission varieties so that it doesn't feel so stale, even though it is a lot of driving around. Personally, as a fan of racing games, mission-based driving games, vehicular combat games, this game pretty much has all of that, which makes it super satisfying to play. You'll notice I have the PC version here. I originally played this one on Xbox, came out on PS2 and GameCube as well, of course, but I would argue if you're able to play it on PC, this is the way to get it. Not only are the PC copies of this significantly cheaper than a lot of the console ones, so it's a nice grab there. Comes in this nice kind of double DVD with small box PC presentation, which I quite like. I've got the old Best Buy sticker on here. But you also, if you play it on PC, you get just, it opens the absolute floodgates for modding. The modding scene for this game is absolutely incredible. This has such a dedicated fan base, which means there are so many mods. Download Lucas's mod launcher, check out the Donut Team website, just grab mods here. There's some great like total conversions. I streamed all of one called Annoy Squidward, which was a SpongeBob total conversion for this game. This is just all around just such a super well realized game. This is, I think, people put this on a pedestal for a reason. I think this is how you do a licensed game right. Make it fun, keep it really solid, very, very respectful and considerate of the source material. Put those inside jokes and gags for those that really love the franchise and are going to enjoy that style of thing. You got the voice cast all coming back, some great writing, once again, solid cutscenes like the Simpsons game. And this is just such a great package. Like I said, I don't think I can really elaborate too much more, but hopefully I was able to give you a little bit more insight on this one. This probably is, with the exception of the Simpsons game and the Konami game, you know, those three are really the top three for Simpsons games, the ones I would recommend absolutely the most. And there you have it, folks. There's my overview of the Simpsons games that I've put some decent time into that I think are maybe worth checking out. Obviously, I couldn't cover everything, and there were some games that I genuinely just have played and don't really care for. I think that's a pretty common experience if you've tried to enjoy Simpsons games of a certain vintage. There are a lot of them that are really, really rough, but hopefully I was able to shine a light on some of the ones that might be worth playing, worth adding to your collections. I would love to hear down below some of your experiences with not only these games, but maybe some of the rough ones we can kind of share in the collected hurtful experiences down below. But I also want to thank everybody for watching, for subscribing. If you like the video, please hit that like button. It helps us out tremendously. And I just want to thank you all once again for taking this ride with me. I hope everybody has a great evening, rest of their day, whatever the case may be. I will see you all very soon. Peace out, folks.
I'm gonna go go to bat for this game, actually, because this is not a good game, okay? I've seen this on multiple lists. I've seen it, people covering all the Simpsons games, worst to best. I'm not gonna name any names or anything, but this often goes, like, toward the bottom. This is not a good game, okay? And I personally find this way more fun than some of the absolute garbage that came out for this franchise. This is not a good game, okay? Some people are like, he's gonna defend it, it must be a good game. Listen, when we're talking about games in a retrospective sense, this is not a good game, okay? I can understand if you got burned buying this back in 2001, you paid like full price or whatever. I can understand being mad about this, but okay, we are looking at this in a retrospective lens. This is not a good game, okay? And playing it in a modern context for some dumb, silly fun, this game more than does the trick. This is not a good game, okay?